Money makes the Russian massacre machine go round, and it's the only reason why Putin and his Kremlin cronies have managed to make the Ukraine war last so long. But now things are changing. It's not just that money is running out, Ukraine has found a way to make sure that Russia's own money pays for the damage the war has caused. And this is money that Putin will never get back. There is a double whammy of issues that have smashed Putin in the face, one related to Russia's frozen assets, and the other being a certain little bubble that would ruin Russia if it happened to go pop. We'll get to the bubble later in the video. First, there are the Russian frozen assets to consider, particularly in terms of how Russia is losing control over those assets. Here's the short version of the story. Russia's frozen billions are now funding Ukraine, and Ukraine won't have to repay a dollar of the money that it uses. At the crux of this story is the 210 billion euros, or approximately $247 billion, that the European Union or EU holds. According to Euromaidan Press, an EU loan mechanism has given Ukraine some much-needed financial breathing room as it defends itself against Putin's invasion. That loan mechanism utilizes the hundreds of billions of dollars of Russian frozen assets frozen in EU banks, and it's set up in such a way that Ukraine isn't on the hook for repaying the loan. Here's how it works. In 2025, Ukraine added $47.3 billion to its public debt. That's obviously terrible news, but it's also an inevitability given the scale of Putin's war against the country. The good news is that though the debt increased, Ukraine's borrowing costs related to that debt have been cut by almost half. The big reason for this is the money that has arrived in Ukraine courtesy of the Group of Seven or G7 nations being backed by frozen Russian central bank assets. Of the $47.3 billion in added debt, the ERA loans provided to Ukraine by the G7 nations account for $37.9 billion. And here's where it gets brilliant for Ukraine. According to Euromaidan Press, the ERA loans that Ukraine has received carry grace periods of between 11 and 12 years, during which no repayments have to be made. When those grace periods end, the repayments start. However, Ukraine won't be making those repayments. The very countries that have loaned Ukraine the money will use the proceeds from the frozen Russian assets left over to service Ukraine's debt. Ukraine won't pay a dollar back. Instead, Russia loses the proceeds from its frozen assets without losing the assets themselves, which is also the EU's way of getting around the legal headaches that would come should Ukraine simply be given the frozen assets. What we see here is a long-term plan that could potentially be repeatable, assuming the Ukraine war rages for several more years. The impact on Ukraine is massive. Thanks to those ERA loans, Ukraine's average borrowing costs have fallen from 7.2% to 4.55%. The cost of its external debt has fallen even lower, dropping from 4.5% to 1.9%, Euromaidan Press reports. Ukraine's Ministry of Finance explained more using figures that it published on December 30th. In total, the ministry says Ukraine managed to secure $52.4 billion in external financing in 2025. With over 70% of that financing coming from the ERA loans that use Russia's frozen assets as security and a repayment mechanism. Other funds included $12 billion in loans received via the Ukraine facility, courtesy of the EU. Another $668 million was provided to Ukraine by the EU via this facility, though these were grants that don't need to be paid back. Beyond that, Ukraine's external financing for 2025 amounts to about $2.3 billion, with loans being provided by the likes of the World Bank, International Monetary Fund, and Japan. It all starts to get a little complex, so let's return to the headline. Ukraine has received almost $38 billion in ERA loans, and it won't have to repay any of it. Russia will. And that is sure to grind Putin's gears as much as another massive development, which we'll discuss in a few minutes. What all of this means is that the EU now holds about 40% of all Ukraine's debt. Again, this is good news for Ukraine. Though there are some members of the EU that are far more sympathetic to Russia than the rest, namely Slovakia, Hungary, and Bulgaria. The vast majority of the nations that make up the bloc have sided with Ukraine and been extremely generous in providing funding for the country's defense. Even as recently as February 3rd, the EU announced another €153 million, or about $180 million in humanitarian aid, that will be split between Ukraine and Moldova, which is another country at risk of Putin's expansionism. The point that we're making here is that 40% of Ukraine's debt is now held by an organization that understands precisely where the debt comes from and is sympathetic to the reasons why it exists. Even if we exclude the ERA loans that will be repaid using the proceeds of the frozen Russian assets, the rest of the debt that Ukraine owes to the EU is likely to be serviced on favorable terms that, if anything, will bring Ukraine and the EU closer. It's a strange situation. Debt makes the heart grow fonder, it seems. Or perhaps more accurately, anger directed at Putin enables the creation of mechanisms that force Russia to pay for Ukraine's defense. It can't be understated just how much of an impact this money will have on Ukraine. As the European Council on Foreign Relations, or ECFR, points out, the International Monetary Fund had previously projected that Ukraine would run out of money that it needs to fund its defense by the spring of 2026, which could have forced Ukraine to capitulate to Putin's maximalist demands. That isn't going to happen anymore. The ERA loans have ensured that. The EU has also showcased its backing of Ukraine by invoking crisis-time powers granted under Article 122 of the Treaty of Functioning of the European Union, or TFEU, which allows for measures like these loans to be adopted with the backing of just a qualified majority of member states, which the ECFR says amounts to 15 countries that combine to represent 65% of the EU's population. In other words, something drastic would have to happen in the EU for the loan to be overturned. Vetoes from a handful of members isn't going to do the job anymore. Interestingly, there are other mechanisms being created by the EU that could help Ukraine in the future. For instance, January 30th brought with it news that a proposed $514 billion European crisis fund could be used by the EU to lend money to countries for defense purposes. Presumably, these loans wouldn't operate in the same way as the ERA loans, meaning they will have to be repaid. However, if it's in the best interests of Europe, and especially if Ukraine becomes an EU member, which President Volodymyr Zelensky believes could happen as soon as 2027, that massive pot of cash could help Ukraine to defend itself for even longer after the ERA loans run dry. Ukraine also has some breathing room in the sense that the ERA loans it has received are going to help it to overcome a demographic crisis that has emerged in the country since Russia invaded. As Euromaidan Press points out, Ukraine's population in the areas of the country that Ukraine still controls has dropped from 41 million before the invasion to 31 million. Of the 10 million shortfall, 2.4 million are in the occupied territories, while 6.7 million are refugees who have fled abroad. Add the tens of thousands of soldiers killed in the war, and you get both humanitarian and economic problems. On the latter front, a country losing 10 million people in 4 years is a country that will naturally experience a labor shortage. With less labor comes fewer opportunities to generate revenue to fund the defense effort, which is one of the many contributing factors to Ukraine's debt having climbed so high in the first place. The loans that are being repaid using Russia's own money won't fix these population problems, but they will allow Ukraine more time. And as you'll discover in a minute, the bubble that we mentioned at the beginning of the video that could go pop at any moment means that Russia may now be running out of time faster than Ukraine. Unfortunately, another dampener has to be placed on all of this positive news. As massive as the ERA loans are for Ukraine, and they will allow the country to fight against Russia for a couple more years, Ukraine is far from out of the woods. The demographic issues that exist now will still loom large once the war is over. The same will go for Ukraine's debt, which has been hovering around the 100% of gross domestic product mark since August 2025. The ERA loans make up a little more than a fifth of the $184 billion in debt that Ukraine needed to service back in August. So repayments will still need to be made and will likely affect Ukraine for years to come after the war ends. But it could be so much worse. The alternative is that Ukraine runs out of money by the spring and ceases to exist in the form that we've known it in since the collapse of the Soviet Union. And that brings us back to the bubble. But before we get to that, you're watching The Military Show. If you haven't subscribed yet, now is the perfect time if you want to see more videos with this kind of insight. Now, as Ukraine and the EU have found a brilliant way to pick Putin's pocket and force Russia to pay for the very defense that it's trying to destroy, there's the bubble. Specifically, the gold bubble that has been propping Russia up for much of the war may be on the verge of popping. On February 3rd, the Telegraph's international business editor Ambrose Evans Pritchard wrote that Russia now finds itself in an interesting position that shares parallels to the one that the UK was in during the early stages of the Second World War. To stay in the fight, the UK had to sell its gold and foreign currency reserves to the US in what was then known as the cash and carry scheme. Russia has been doing the same for much of the Ukraine war, backed by a massive rally in gold prices that has added more than $200 billion to Putin's war chest since he invaded Ukraine. Putin relies heavily on that gold. As far back as December 2024, Euronews was reporting that gold had become one of Russia's most important strategic resources, especially as sanctions have hindered the country's ability to sell oil and gas. At the time, Russia ranked 5th on the list of countries with the largest gold reserves, with about 2,571 US short tons, or 2,333 metric tons. Russia has been trying to amass more gold reserves since Putin launched his invasion. In February, the Telegraph reported that Russia has been stepping up its involvement in Africa's gold trade, with stepping up being shorthand for sending mercenaries and Kremlin-backed juntas to take control of gold mines in the African continent. Russia wants more gold than it already has because gold is a product that is very difficult to sanction. It's far easier to physically move around than something like oil, which makes it a commodity that can be smuggled away from the notice of the normal financial networks. Currency sales leave a paper trail. The sale of gold, if done sneakily enough, can leave no evidence beyond the buyer holding more gold than they did in the past, and that's assuming that the buyer or seller is transparent about the gold that they hold. Putin wanted all of this gold because he knew he would find buyers. China is chief among them, with Evans Pritchard noting that China has been helping to keep Putin's war economy afloat with his version of cash and carry, increasingly in the form of direct gold bullion deliveries from the vaults of the Russian central bank. But now Russia has a problem. The value of gold is tanking. And as the price drops, billions of dollars are being wiped out of the Russian war chest in a matter of days. It doesn't matter that Russia still has massive gold reserves. When the value of that gold declines, there isn't much that Putin can do about it. The early stages of what could be a gold crash have come in phases, and it all started the week beginning January 26th. On Friday at the end of the week, analysts were stunned when the value of gold and silver plummeted. Silver fell as much as 30% in a day, but more importantly for Russia, the value of gold crashed by about 10%. Euronews offered some more figures along with some context. It pointed out the value of gold had reached a new record high of $5,600 per ounce on January 29th, only to collapse to about $4,770 per ounce the following day. To understand what this means, we need to do some maths. Earlier we said that Russia had a little over 2,500 US short tons of gold in its reserves in 2024. If we assume that the number has stayed the same, and it likely hasn't due to Putin's selling off Russian gold to fund his war, we can get a very rough idea of how much money Russia lost in 24 hours. One short ton, which is the US version of a ton, is equivalent to 29,166.7 troy ounces, which is the standard gold measurement. Multiply 29,166.7 troy ounces by $5,600 per ounce and you get a little over $163.33 million per ton of gold. Multiply that by about 2,500 tons of gold that were in Russia's reserves in 2024, and it all adds up to a little over $408 billion. Then we do the same for the price following the decline. That gives us a price of $139.12 million per ton of gold, which adds up to about $347.8 billion. In other words, about $60 billion lost in 24 hours. Now, these are rough figures based on what Russia's gold reserves used to look like. Still, they offer a glimpse into the sort of pain that Putin is now feeling as a result of market factors that are well outside of his control. The question that has to be answered now is simple. Was the crash we saw in gold prices on January 30th a massive market correction, or the pinprick that is about to make the gold bubble go pop? Prices are still all over the place, as Evans Pritchard pointed out in his piece for The Telegraph. Putin has a large enough buffer to prosecute the war at today's gold price of $4,925, up from $1,900 3 years ago. The open question is whether gold is on its way down to much lower structural levels, he says. However, questions still remain about whether the value of gold is going to fall to what the writer calls lower structural levels. Evans Pritchard points to signs that the later rally in gold prices that we've seen since January 30th isn't necessarily the start of a super rally that will see the price of gold rise back to what it was. He points to inflation falling across the West, adding that the rise of AI is also deflationary as it's raising productivity rates. It's possible that gold could fall back down and to levels below those seen during the mini-crash in the near future. Others feel like this was just a blip on the radar. As Forbes reports, JP Morgan has raised its year-end forecast on gold to $6,300 per ounce, stating that the long-term rally in gold has not and will not be linear. So for now, we once again digest, reset, and repeat. Deutsche Bank offers a similarly high projection of $6,000 per ounce. Putin will be praying they're correct. If they're not, Russia's gold will become a lot less valuable. Should the gold bubble burst, Putin may find that he isn't able to rely on China's President Xi Jinping to bail him out. China may be buying a lot of Russian gold now, with physical shipments of large quantities having started fairly recently. However, to Xi, China's relationship with Russia is one of opportunity rather than camaraderie, and China's president has shown that he is willing to leave Putin in the dust for better opportunities. Right now, Evans Pritchard says, China is trying to rebuild bridges with major European economic powers following almost 4 years of providing indirect support to Russia. If those powers tell Xi that Putin's gold is off the table, he may well sacrifice that commodity for trade relationships that could prove much more prosperous. There are plenty of examples of Chinese opportunism to support this theory. In December, The Telegraph reported that exports of Chinese vehicles to Russia had increased 7-fold by 2024 versus 2023 levels. This has played a huge role in forcing Russia's domestic car manufacturers such as Lada and Kamaz to slow production. The latter has seen demand for its vehicles decline by 60%, the Telegraph reports, while the former has cut production by almost 50%. China saw an opening and leapt through it so forcefully that it's now causing major issues for Russian vehicle manufacturers. China has also been taking advantage of Western sanctions to buy enormous amounts of Russian oil and gas at steep discounts. Again, Xi took advantage of an opportunity. And as all of this is happening, Chinese investments into Russia have collapsed from $1.2 billion in 2011 to just $400 million by the end of 2025. In this context, China is not a real ally to Russia. As Evans Pritchard puts it, the chances that China will extend Putin a latter-day lend-lease to help him secure his maximalist war aims in Ukraine must be close to zero. In other words, as soon as Putin is more trouble than he's worth for China, Xi will leave Russia's president in the dust, and that could leave Russia with a whole lot of gold that is worth less than it was, and nobody to sell it to in any great quantities. And that's why this week has been a double whammy for Russia. Putin has to try to figure out how to navigate what could be a collapse in the value of one of the few commodities that Russia has in abundance, all as Ukraine has been granted an economic lifeline, a lifeline that sees Russia paying for the defense of Putin's enemy no less, and one that may allow Ukraine to attrit the Russian military and economy to such an extent that Putin is forced to pull the plug on his supposed special military operation. Russia's president is also struggling under the weight of recent US sanctions that are slowly bringing about the collapse of his country's oil industry. Assets are being sold off, oil companies are going to the Kremlin with their caps in their hands, and tax revenue from oil is falling quickly. Find out more in our video. And remember to subscribe to The Military Show to get more coverage of Russia's many financial woes. And thank you, as always, for watching.